Present to you the Honorable Dr. Angel Smith. Give it up for Dr. Smith.
Distinguished guests, members of the platform, ladies and gentlemen, pleasant good day to you. I would first like to thank the organizing committee for Territory Day for inviting me to give this address here today. When I was called by the Deputy Director of Culture to deliver this address, I put her through the ringers as I would normally do, trying to find a way out of doing it. At the time, I was not aware that the chairman of the committee was in fact Mrs. Parsons, because now after that I realized that there was no way she could go back and tell Mrs. Parsons that I was not doing it, because then I would get a call directly from Miss P. And I'm sure I didn't want to go down that road. In 2006, while I was serving as Chief Education Officer, during the tenure of Mrs. Parsons as Minister, I found while going through the records that year was in fact the 50th anniversary of the Virgin Islands becoming a colony and thereafter being referred to as a territory. During that time, I decided that I would take the time and research the topic and put a proposal forward to the government. I discussed it with Mrs. Parsons and it was agreed upon, and she took the matter to Executive Council, where in fact it was agreed that a celebration would be held to commemorate that event. During that commemoration activity, I was invited to chair the program. And during the program, I interspersed several bits of historic information that I had gleaned from the records. And I should say that that research took me as far as Trinidad. What I did was whenever I went on any meetings assigned to me as Chief Education Officer, I would take time out to visit the library and whatever archives there were in Trinidad and Antigua, wherever I was, to find information. And I shared that information with the audience at the time. At the end of the celebration, Mrs. Parsons called me aside, as the old people would say, and she said, with a little bit of stammering, "Mr. Smith, I'm tired of this nonsense." And I got a little uptight and started wondering what I had done wrong. But then she continued, "Every time you keep coming with a little bit of information here, a little bit of information there, why you don't just go and do the research and get it over with?" At that point, I had not thought about actually going off to study and doing research on the history of the Virgin Islands. With Mrs. Parsons' encouragement and the government's approval, I then went on a research scholarship with the University of Hull to conduct research on the history of the Virgin Islands. Mrs. Parsons, I stand on your shoulders today. Thank you. This year, we celebrate 70 years since the 1949 demonstrations. And the committee has invited me to speak directly on that event in BVI history. As I do so, I want first to read for you a poem that appeared in The Torch, which was, as it were, a newspaper publication in the 1940s. And the poem was written by E.L.B. I assume it was an anonymous poem submitted, and it was submitted in celebration of the birthday of His Honor, the Commissioner Cruikshank. I read the poem. It says, "In these British Virgin Islands, far-spread empire's dignity is vested more or less in one high-favored man of destiny. From influential councilman to lowliest petitioner, all bow in deference to him, His Honor the Commissioner. All creatures that he sees, both living and inanimate, the rocks, the trees, the cows, the fish, the crawling dumb invertebrates, and higher forms of life such as the preacher and the parishioner, all are beneath the sway of him, His Honor the Commissioner. He rules beneficent and just, extends from 50 miles or more from Jasmine-Dyke's sharp western end to Anegada's eastern shore. In that domain, his word is law. No tide should rise, no wind should store without official sanction from His Honor, the Commissioner. Should Gabriel's great trumpet sound over these isles, its notes of dread, as told in ancient prophecy, calling the living and the dead might rise, but first they'll say, only with your permission, sir, awaiting final word from His Honor, the Commissioner." The political status of the Virgin Islands in the 1949, during which time we had that demonstration, we were but a presidency of the Leeward Islands colony. Headquarters was in Antigua, and the other members of the colony were Antigua, St. Kitts Nevis, Anguilla, and Montserrat. There was a General Legislative Council that met in Antigua and passed laws for all of the presidencies that formed part of the Federation. The social and economic status of these islands was one that no one would recognize today. In fact, there was little or no employment. Our schools were run almost entirely by the church, the Anglican Church and the Methodist Church, with the exception of the Rotong Primary School and the Virgin Islands Secondary School, which were run by government. There was one doctor in the Virgin Islands, and that doctor served all the islands. The Public Works Department was led by one Mr. Franklin. There was virtually no paid employment in the Virgin Islands. And where there was paid employment, the amount was very low. Virgin Islanders at that time found employment in the U.S. Virgin Islands. In fact, World War II had brought a whole different economic status, because development of Burnfield, which is now the area referred to as the Cyril E. King Airport, and the subbase by the American government between 1939 and 1945, called for an influx of migrant workers. The population of the Virgin Islands was about 6,000 at that time. Over about 1,000 persons or more found employment in St. Thomas. They worked on what they call 49 days. The immigration laws allow you to come in to work, and you work for 49 days, you left for 49 days, and you return thereafter. Several persons would go in, work for their 49 days, come out, and go back into what was referred to as the window. They went back illegally so that they could continue their employment. By 1949, however, after the end of the Second World War, the Americans then decided that they needed to tighten their immigration, and there was mass deportation of the Virgin Islanders from St. Thomas. Persons returned to these Virgin Islands where there was no employment and the economic situation was considered dire. It was at this time that Theodore Faulkner, a fisherman from Anegada, came to Roetown with his wife, who was pregnant and having complications. She was required to stay about 2 months on bed rest in the hospital. Faulkner, because of his experience in the past, would not return to Anegada, leaving his wife behind. You see, at some point before that, Faulkner had brought his sick mother to the hospital in Roetown, and he left. And on his way to Anegada, his mother died. By the time he got to Anegada and the news came and he returned to Tortola, she was already buried. If you go to the Methodist Cemetery here in town and you walk into the gate, right at the entrance, you would see one tomb that is entirely different to any other tomb that you would see inside that cemetery. But if you go to Anegada, you will see several others like it. That tomb is in the shape of an obelisk. That is the tomb that commemorates Faulkner's mother. Because of his experience, he would not return to Anegada and he stayed in Roetown. The marketplace was then the social and economic center of the Virgin Islands. Everyone gathered at the market to sell provisions and to hear the latest. Whatever you wanted to know, you went by the market, and that's where you knew what was happening. But while Faulkner was hanging around town, he heard many stories. He heard about how His Honor, the Commissioner, was abusing his power as the administrator of these islands. He heard persons comment about the fact that we have no legislature to pass laws for us, and we must be entirely dependent on the General Legislative Council in Antigua that pass laws that may be applicable to Antigua but were not applicable to the Virgin Islands. Faulkner heard all of these stories, and he too had his own stories, because the reason why his wife had to come to Tortola was because the doctor could not visit Anegada or the other islands on a regular basis. As he spoke with persons, he realized that he needed to air the grievances of the community. Faulkner, as they would say, filled with fine water, because at the market there was a well-known bar where everyone gathered. And Faulkner decided to take up his soapbox and to start to speak on the issues. He talked about the fact that there was no employment in the Virgin Islands, the fact that they were paying high taxes, the fact that there was lack of services by the government. And he talked about the exploits of then Commissioner Cruikshank. Faulkner did something that no one else would do. He dared to criticize the government of the day. As Faulkner started speaking, people would gather to listen. And as we know in these Virgin Islands, what people like more than commotion is good melee. And everyone gathered to hear what Faulkner had to say, because every time he spoke, he had a different story to tell. When pressed, they asked Faulkner, well, how do you know these things? Faulkner said, I had a dream. And he would start all of his speeches by saying, I had a dream. And they said, but really, how do you know this? He said, well, you see, I walk with the Savior, and he reveals these things to me. Faulkner did what no one else would do. Other persons stood on the sideline, and they watched and they listened. And eventually, two individuals came forward to join Faulkner in his nightly lectures and discussions with the people. They were, in fact, I.G. Fonseca and De Castro, Carlton Fax De Castro. The commissioner, His Honor as he was called, was considered a source of the problem. H.R. Penn, in his memoirs, described him as a bright Oxford man, the most educated administrator that these islands had had. J.R. O'Neill, on the other hand, said that His Honor, the commissioner, had one major problem. He could only divide by two. J.R. O'Neill's conclusion was based on the fact that there was a government reservoir that was built above what was then the Cottage Hospital. Persons about my age and beyond would know about this reservoir. And that reservoir held about 100,000 gallons of water. Half of that water was for Government House, and the other half for Road Town. It was divided in two. There was a grant given to the territory to refurbish and upgrade public buildings, $124,000. Half of that went to refurbish and refurnish Government House, and the other half to do minor work around the territory. But the clinching point was when the generator at Government House stopped working. His Honor, the commissioner, instructed that the generator at the hospital be removed and taken to run the power at Government House. The public meetings that Faulkner held saw persons gathering to listen and to understand what was happening in the territory. One of the stories that was told to Faulkner was with regards to the then Director of Public Works, Mr. Franklin, who it was said found a way to use the government's material to build himself a boat. The informant who then started talking to give out that information and went to the commissioner, telling the commissioner that something should be done, he was fired. Faulkner pushed for political involvement in the life of these Virgin Islands. The meetings that he spearheaded with Fonseca and De Castro were not only held in Road Town, but they started to spread to different parts of Tortola and eventually to the outer islands. It was decided that a mass demonstration would be held on November 24th, 1949. That demonstration was well organized. I want us to remember that in 1949, there was little or no road infrastructure in the Virgin Islands. There were no mass communication in terms of vehicular transportation. There was no telephone. But the march was organized. The motor launch, the Joan of Arc and the Islander, were used to bring persons from the outer islands to Road Town. From all over the countryside and in the distant villages and Tortola, people came on foot, on horseback, on donkey, or on mule. Over 1,000, close to 1,500 persons gathered at the bandstand in Rowtown, where they started with speeches, had prayers, and then proceeded to march through Rowtown. 2 petitions were presented and signed, one calling for the removal of the commissioner, and the other one, in essence, asking for the establishment of a legislative council. The preamble to the petition, one section of it said, "We have endured and endured until our power of endurance has failed us." In fact, it was saying that they were asking for freedom. They were demanding freedom, that they wanted freedom. They no longer wanted a government without representation. They were tired of paying taxes and had no way to ensure that the government of the day cared about them. The petitions were sent to the governor in Antigua and eventually went on to the United Kingdom. The call to remove the commissioner was not acknowledged, but it was agreed that the Virgin Islands should have a legislative council. On the 20th of November, 1950, the first election was held, following a constitutional committee that was chairman by H.R. Penn, where they accepted and recommended a constitution that was similar to that of Montserrat. There were 4 seats in the first legislative council. They were held at large. As we know now, we have 4 at-large seats in our election. At that time, the first 4 persons were all elected at large: Fonseca, Penn, and Bruce. Faulkner did contest that election, but he was not successful. Following that election in 1950, there was a review of the Constitution, and 5 seats were established, with the 5th seat being Virgin Gorda and Anegada. Faulkner again contested in that election, and he was elected and became a member of the Legislative Council. You see, persons in Anegada felt that the way forward in the British Virgin Islands at that time was in fact spearheaded by one of their own, and there was no way that the council should go on and he was not a member. So they all came together on Anegada and Virgin Gorda and voted for Theodore Faulkner. One of the government agents at the day said that Faulkner was so uneasy about the election because there were several persons who were scheduled to vote, who were on the voters list in Anegada, and they had been away, and they did not get back to Anegada in time to vote. And when they were returning to Tortola with the ballot, he said, well, you know, no one would know if we opened the ballot and we voted for those fellows, because, they would have voted for me. But the agent said, no, we can't do that. But when they got to Rowtown, they found that they, in fact, had come in and they had already cast their ballots, and Faulkner was successful in that election. What we learned from the 1949 demonstration is that as Virgin Islanders, yes, we endure a lot. And Virgin Islanders are not seen as the people who are quick to make noise. In fact, there are those among us who feel that Virgin Islanders are passive and they take everything. But as a historian, I would say to you that that is not true. In fact, history has told us that Virgin Islanders have learned to be patient because they found that patience was the key to their success. When all of the other Caribbean colonies found themselves going through revolts, the Virgin Islands, the enslaved people in these Virgin Islands, in fact, took whatever was being thrown at them. But they had one condition: we might be enslaved, but we are not slaves. And that was shown by how they dealt with their slave masters. In fact, going through the records, I have found that on numerous occasions, there were enslaved persons who were recorded as absent because they ran away. In fact, I found one letter that was written by one slave owner. She had written to this lady in St. Thomas who had run away, and she knew where she was, and she asked her to return. She said, I will come back under one condition: if I am allowed to purchase my freedom.
That's right.
And that was how she got her freedom. In fact, what we've noticed in our history is that it was the patience of our forefathers that had allowed them to become owners of these Virgin Islands. When slavery ended in these Virgin Islands, the estates that operated were bankrupt. In fact, sugar died in natural death. Their economy went belly up. The new economy in the Virgin Islands was based on cattle production. You needed land for cattle. The bankrupt estates then were put on auction. And who was going to buy land in an island where there was no economy? As the estates came on auction, families pooled their money and bought the estates on which their forefathers were enslaved for generations. When persons talk about this big name family and that big name family and how they have a lot of land, nothing all go so. All it was ex-slaves who came together and bought the land so that they could survive, planting provision and tending to their animals. When cattle became the new economy, in 1853, when the government of the day felt that the only way they could balance their budget was to raise the tax on cattle, the inhabitants of these Virgin Islands said, look, we can't afford it. Don't raise the tax. The then president of the Virgin Islands said, well, he would consider if they submit a formal petition. They said, if it's petition you want, petition you're going to get. And they burned the town down.
Yes, they did.
They were patient. They waited, and it is the same thing that happened again in 1949. They waited patiently for the restoration of the Legislative Council. Pushed by Faulkner, they took matters into their own hands and protested, demonstrated, and sent petitions to the Foreign Office, which in fact then responded by ensuring that the Legislative Council was reinstated. Today, we stand on the shoulders of these giants.
Yes, yes.
We stand on the shoulders of Theodore Faulkner, a man who was innovative, a man who was a great thinker, a man who had spent his life working all over the Caribbean. He had been to Aruba, working in the oil refinery. He had worked in the Dominican Republic. He had worked in the U.S. Virgin Islands. But then he came back to Anegada, and at some point in time, he realized that it made a difference if we would speak up and try to ensure that we can survive in these Virgin Islands. When everything else failed, The Virgin Islander realizes that it is up to him to make a difference in his own country. I was asked to give an address, but I want to confess that I'm just a storyteller. I love to tell stories, and I hope that you enjoyed this story that I've shared